It's an honor to be in front of you tonight. I come to this story through two doorways, the doorway of a granddaughter and the doorway of a storyteller. Dr. Venkataswamy, who you all see there, was my grandmother's eldest brother, my granduncle. We called him grandfather. Actually, we called him Dr. Grandfather. And that's really what he was to us. He was an elder and a healer. Those were the twin roles he played. This man never married, never had any children of his own, but he left the world an incredible legacy. Today, nearly 6 years after his passing, I continue to find myself unpacking the gifts that he embedded in our lives. And I'm a one-time filmmaker and a writer in a family of 21 eye surgeons, and still counting. We've got a few more in the pipeline. And I often joke, I made a film called Infinite Vision that follows the work of Dr. V, and then worked on the book Infinite Vision. And I say only partly in jest to the family that these are my apologies for not being an eye surgeon myself. And in the last decade of chronicling this story, I think I've come to learn a pretty humbling truth, and that is that stories in a very real way can also help people see the world a little bit better, a little bit more clearly. And the story of Aravind and the story of Dr. V is one of those luminous stories that definitely has that potential. Where does this story begin? And before I jump into that, I'd like to bring some words of Dr. V into the room through a journal entry that he wrote. And this was back in the 1980s, before his vision had really taken root and the manifestation of it had been realized. Aravind was a speck on the horizon. And in his journal at that time, he wrote of his aspiration, his twin aspirations, and they were, one, to give sight for all. And the second was to see all as one. To give sight for all and to see all as one. There's something ultra-practical in there, and then something deeply profound. The deep practicality of setting up service delivery mechanisms to end one form of human suffering, to give sight for all. But to do that from a mindset that recognizes our ultimate interconnection. To do that from a mindset rooted in compassion. These were his two aspirations, and that really is the arc that this story travels, from the practical to the profound. It dances between strategy and spirit, between the gritty, changing, choppy realities of the external world and that internal still point, that anchor of our values, our compass, and that universal goodness. This man was born in 1918 in a small village in southern India, the eldest of 5 children, walked barefoot to school, wrote his lessons in the sand. By his 10th birthday, he'd lost 3 cousins in childbirth. There were no doctors in the village, no medicines to be had, no one they could run to for help. And at that young age, he committed himself to that vision of becoming a doctor and preventing such untimely deaths. He put himself through school, medical school, and then in his early 30s, when he was just about to embark on a career in obstetrics, he was struck by a crippling form of rheumatoid arthritis that permanently twisted and froze his fingers out of shape. He was bedridden for 2 years and was told his dream of becoming an obstetrician was a no-go. When he had recovered enough he couldn't sit, stand, walk, or anything for quite a long time, and when he'd finally recovered enough strength to return to the medical field, he ended up by some sort of, he calls it sheer accident. We think of it more as a divine accident. He ended up in ophthalmology, and he trained those fingers to cut and operate on the eye and restore sight. Those fingers, in his time as a government surgeon alone, he performed over 100,000 sight-restoring surgeries. Then the year 1976, and he did phenomenal things as a government surgeon. He was, for all that work, awarded one of the nation's highest honors, the Padma Shri. Then 1976 rolled around, and that was the year that Dr. V hit retirement age. That's the mandatory retirement age, but he wasn't ready to play golf. There was so much unfinished work in the field. And so he decided with his brothers and sisters to start an 11-bed eye clinic in Madurai, a temple city of southern India. His 5 brothers and sisters and their spouses, they had no money, no business plan, no safety net. But they did have a mission, and their mission was to end curable blindness. They had 11 beds, and the world had 45 million blind people. 80% of that was curable. They were a little bit outnumbered there, 11 beds with 45 million blind. But fast forward a little bit, 35 odd years later, they've got a network. There's only 4 hospitals shown there, but it's actually a network of 7 tertiary care facilities and 40 smaller vision centers. They are the world's largest and most productive eye care facility. What does that mean? It means in that time, since inception, they've seen over 32 million patients and performed over 4 million surgeries. The vast majority of that either completely free of charge or at ultra-subsidized rates. The numbers around Aravind are magical and they're fun to look at. One of my favorite slides is the next one, and it shows you how many eye surgeries the average surgeon at Aravind does per year with a kind of global comparison next to it. The average eye surgeon at Aravind does 2,000 eye surgeries a year. The national average in India is around 400. The United States isn't on that graph, but in this country it's about 200 surgeries a year. So, incredible productivity, but this isn't just a story about number, about volume. Sometimes when people hear the story, they think, amazing, this kind of work being done on a charity basis in the developing world, really inspiring, but how relevant is it to us sitting here in this auditorium today? The next slide is a comparison that kind of speaks to that point. Healthcare, we all know, is not exactly in its golden era in the West. And the next slide is a comparison of Aravind's productivity against the National Health System of the United Kingdom, which is their main provider of health and eye care. And they do around 500,000 surgeries, eye surgeries, a year. Aravind does around 300,000. So you've got a single organization in the developing world doing close to 60% of the volume of the United Kingdom in eye care. And then you look at the cost comparisons. How much does it cost the United Kingdom to provide that care? It costs them 1.6 billion pounds. It costs Aravind less than 1% of that. So you've got a high volume, low cost system. And then the first thing that creeps into people's heads here is, well, that means quality must be taking a hit somewhere. They've done fairly recent studies that compare complication rates at Aravind with the Royal College of Ophthalmology, again in the United Kingdom. They studied the complication rates across 20 different types of complications. Aravind's quality outcomes were found to match and in many cases exceed that of its Western counterpart. You've got a high volume, high quality, low cost system. That's the tripart mantra for healthcare providers anywhere. That's the sweet spot we all want to be in. And when you look at what makes this possible, how do these people do this? When you pop open the hood and look underneath, you find an upside-down business model. This is an organization that turns completely on its head conventional wisdom for what it means to run a successful business. And it does this and triumphs. There are 3 things, before I talk about the different aspects of that model, there are 3 commitments that Dr. V and his team brought to the organization very early on. They were part of the founding DNA of the organization. And there were 3 commitments that were all linked to compassion. The first commitment, we will not turn anyone away based on financial need. The second commitment, we will not compromise on quality. And the third was really interesting. We must be self-reliant. So what those 3 commitments meant was that whatever Aravind did over its 35 years and beyond, it had to do it with compassion, with excellence, and with its own resources. Service for all. So that first thing that it did, it ripped the price tag off of a sight-restoring surgery. And it did this in a country where there are 12 million blind people, the majority of whom live on less than $2 a day. So when you have another constraint of being self-reliant, that seemed like a really bizarre move. And then the next thing they did was even crazier. They said, we're going to let the patient decide whether or not they pay. And they did that because they wanted to design for dignity. Dr. V would say repeatedly to his team, we're not here just to restore sight. We have to affirm people's dignity. And if you're blind in rural India, very quickly that means you've lost not just your sight, you've lost your livelihood. Very soon after, your place in your family, your place in society and in the community. In giving people choice, Dr. V and his team were affirming their dignity. In this system, a barefoot farmer can come in and decide to access paid services, where the man who would become the future president of India, this is a true story, can come in and choose to access free services. So, and in this thing, the really interesting part is that free is not seen as a charitable handout. Zero in this model is a legitimate price point, and it's one among a series of other price points. It's a self-selecting user system. The rates go from zero all the way up to market. High quality is free. We've already seen that. They didn't put a price tag on good quality. The doctors rotate between the free and the paying sections. You don't have separate specialists looking at the rich patients and others looking at the poor. Quality outcomes are monitored with equal rigor across free and paying. Broaden the pie. This is one of my favorites. Aravind had a marketing team, but the marketing team was exclusively focused on the patient who couldn't pay them. I don't know much about marketing, but I'm pretty sure that's not the way it usually works. They went through extraordinary lengths to find the person who wasn't in their service loop, who couldn't pay them even if they knew about the hospital, and even if they could access the service, they wouldn't have anything to give them. And the way they did this was by going out into the villages and finding people who needed care and bringing the services to them. And they did this with a mindset that really owned the barriers. They learned this from a blind beggar. What happened in the early days, they said, look, we've got free service, come and get it. We'll give you surgery for free. And very few people showed up. And it was puzzling to them until they talked to a beggar who was blind, and he told them, look, you tell me your service is free, but to get to your hospital, I need bus fare. Once I get there, I need accommodation, I need food, I need medicine, I need return transport. I'm 80 years old, I can't come alone. If my son comes with me, he loses his daily wage. Your free service costs me 100 rupees. When they heard that, they decided we've got to own the barriers. And so they sent out medical teams, doctors and nurses who would go and conduct what they called eye camps. Thousands of patients would be screened in the villages. Those who needed care were bussed back to the base hospital, given treatment, accommodation, food, medicines, return transport, and follow-up care, all completely free of charge. And this happens not once or twice a year. This happens 40 or 50 times a week, over 2,000 times a year. Upward of 76,000 patients are brought in every year through those eye camps. Once you have that kind of volume coming into the system, you need really efficient processes to handle them. And to set up those processes, they had a really interesting model that they were emulating. McDonald's. What do blindness and burgers have in common? It's a puzzling question, but when Dr. V came to the United States in the early 80s, he was fascinated by the golden arches that he saw everywhere. And he kind of sidestepped the public health implications of the corporation. And what he was looking at when he saw McDonald's was the power of standardization, scale, product, reliability, and consistency, that kind of access and affordability. And he would say over and over again, if we can provide eye care the way McDonald's provides hamburgers, the problem of blindness would be gone. And so what he did was he tried to bring in assembly line techniques into the hospital. He looked at the process from the moment a patient steps into the hospital and registers to the point of discharge, and he divided that up into discrete sets of tasks that were then assigned to highly trained paraprofessionals. And these paraprofessionals were more often than not high school women recruited from the local villages and put through an intensive training program, a 2-year training program, one that's been accredited, by the way, by the same organization that accredits nursing training here in the States. The whole idea of process improvement and process flow comes into play beautifully in the operating rooms, where you have rows of operating beds, and as the surgeon is operating on a patient on one side, a team of nurses is busy readying the next patient on the adjacent bed. The lag time between surgeries is the time it takes for the surgeon to swing the microscope over to the other side. The fastest surgeon at Aravind can do a cataract surgery in 3.5 minutes. Not just because he's a phenomenal surgeon, but because of the phenomenal systems that surround him or her. Self-reliance is the thing that really catches the business world's eye. Harvard did a case study on Aravind in the early 90s. It's a mandatory case. Every single MBA student that goes through Harvard has to do the Aravind case. The idea that something that operates in this way, that has zero as a price point, that allows patients to choose whether they pay or not, can actually be self-sustaining, baffles them. To give you an idea of Aravind's self-reliance, in 2009, 2010, they brought in an operating surplus of $13 million on revenue of $29 million. It is a phenomenally self-sustaining organization, and that money comes from patient revenue, not from government donation, not from philanthropic contributions or outside funding agencies. It's patient-driven revenue. But that idea of self-reliance doesn't just restrict itself to the question of money. At Aravind, self-reliance is really more about a mindset than money. It's a way of identifying and employing and engaging with your resources. So that self-reliance extends even to the human resources. Dr. V would tell his team time and again, you don't just find people, you have to build them. So he built his team. He recruited those nurses from the villages and trained them to become world-class medical professionals. 90% of the doctors at Aravind are trained within its own walls. And it doesn't just train its own staff, it trains staff from all over the world, including residents from Cal Pacific, from UCSF, from Harvard, from Mass Eye and Ear. The best of the West have trained at Aravind. The other thing about self-reliance, before I go to the last point on this slide, is that it gives the organization the freedom to follow its mission with integrity. And this came into play in really sharp relief in the 80s, when the intraocular lens became the standard for cataract surgery in the West. In India, it was still very expensive. Each intraocular lens implant cost anywhere between $150 to $300. It wasn't affordable. Aravind could not scale that to all of its patients. And it wasn't acceptable for it to have one quality of care for its rich patients and another for its poor. And when it tried to troubleshoot this problem, it came up with a bizarre solution. It said, well, if we can't buy lenses at an affordable price, we're going to have to make them ourselves. And it did. It set up an internationally certified manufacturing unit, a group of doctors, and they produced an intraocular lens that was tested in labs in the United States and proclaimed world class. They brought down the price from $150 to $300 to $10. Then they drove it down further to $2. Now they export their lenses to over 120 countries around the world. And they didn't just stop at lenses. They now make over 50 different kinds of ophthalmic pharmaceuticals. They make sutures. They make ophthalmic equipment. They try to find every bit that they can to drive down the price, anything that they can produce at a less expensive but still high quality standard, they do. The last point here is something. So here we have this recipe that Aravind has perfected. It's kind of got this secret sauce for success. What happens when we have that kind of secret sauce? Typically, we build a fortress around it. We put it under lock and key. We say, this is what gives us our competitive edge. Dr. B had a very different mindset. He said, if we have something that works, we have to give it away. So Aravind does something very counterintuitive. It trains its competition. It works with over 270 hospitals across the developing world, some in the developed world. Many of these hospitals are in its own backyard. And it invites them actively to come in and look at its processes, look at its systems, look under the hood. It makes everything open source. It's trained over 6,000 healthcare professionals at different levels all over the world, working with people in 60 different countries. It has a separate training and consulting institute that is devoted exclusively to this work. So you look at this kind of phenomenon that is Aravind and the story of Dr. V. You look at Dr. V's story and you see this, it's kind of a David and Goliath story of one man in his unthinkable frailty. Think of it, 58. He was 58 when he started this, standing up against these incredible odds and winning this luminous victory, not for personal gain, not for personal benefit, but for humanity. But it isn't just the story of one individual. It's a story that intersects with so much else, with social entrepreneurship, with global health, with moral leadership, with family enterprise. He has 3 generations of his family, more than 35 members of his family working under the same roof with him. How do you do that? And it also intersects with spirituality, with questions of service. And so it spills over any label that we can attach to this, and it asserts its relevance, because at its core, really, this is a story about our individual potential and our collective possibility. And there are a few unwritten directives that run through this story as threads. And the first is quite simply, stay rooted in compassion. More than anything else, this is a story that shows how compassion can drive scale, can drive sustainability, can drive excellence, quality, all of those things that we're looking for. Compassion can be the engine behind that. Serve and deserve. This was something that was very key to Dr. B's philosophy, this idea of do the work and the money will follow. The fact that if you follow your mission, if you align with your mission, the resources will be galvanized, and it will align in a much stronger way than if you were driving it through money alone. Create a movement, not dominance. That idea of, again, training your competition. And the fourth, practice for perfect vision. Dr. B was someone who very keenly understood that while his set task in the world was addressing an external form of blindness, his success in that task was strongly linked to his ability to address internal forms of blindness, whether that was anger or greed or fear or jealousy or uncertainty or annoyance, all the petty little things that can sometimes cloud our vision and make it harder to act in a way that is fully aligned. And so that idea that he believed in very strongly was that clarity in thought and action is linked to discipline of mind and heart. So he showed up to practice compassion every day of his life, and he had that belief that when we commit to sharpening our self-awareness and to pushing the boundaries of our compassion, we truly do become more perfect instruments of whatever it is that is our deepest truth. Just one quote from Dr. B that I'd like to leave you with before I end tonight. And this is, I think, emblematic of his deepest wisdom. And he said, when we grow in spiritual consciousness, we identify with all that is in the world, and there is no exploitation. It is ourselves we are helping. It is ourselves we are healing.